The storm was relentless. Outside, the sky had turned a dark, swirling mass of snow and ice. The winds howled like a beast in pain, bending the trees and whipping the snow into fierce torrents. The air was thick with icy particles that stung the skin, making even the bravest pause before stepping into the wild chaos. On this harsh, frozen world, survival was a daily battle, one that the human colonists had grown used to. Jonah sat by the small fire in his shelter, staring at the flickering flames. His breath rose in steady clouds in the cold air, but the fire kept him warm enough to stay comfortable. He was used to the solitude. There had been no one else for miles, and the thought of that didn't bother him. He liked the quiet, the stillness of it. This was his home, this shelter made of metal and stone, surrounded by the thick forests and frozen plains of the alien planet. He had been stationed here for years, helping with the terraforming project and surviving on his own, learning the ways of the land. The days of communication with Earth were long gone. The storm season had made sure of that. The storm season on this planet was different. It didn't just bring snow and ice. It brought complete isolation. For weeks, even months, nothing could leave or enter. They were cut off from the rest of the galaxy. He had learned to live with it. Jonah looked up at the small window above him. The thick snowflakes outside created a swirling blur, making it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the shelter. He wondered, as he had many times before, how far the storm would reach this time. But he wasn't worried. He had lived through worse. He had learned to respect the storms and endure them. It was part of the price for living here. He shifted, adjusting his position by the fire. It crackled, its warmth making his face feel a little more alive. He closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the silence. But that peace was shattered with a sudden, loud thud. The door to the shelter slammed open, the wind forcing its way inside like an angry guest. Jonah jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by the door. A figure staggered into the shelter, her breath heavy and labored. The storm had clearly taken its toll on her. Her clothes were torn and her hair covered in ice. She was a stranger. Her skin was a soft gray, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She froze at the sight of him. Jonah's first instinct was to ask her if she was all right, but the shock of her sudden appearance in his home left him momentarily speechless. His eyes scanned her quickly. She was humanoid, but there was something otherworldly about her. Her slender frame, the strange markings on her arms, and the way she stood, as if she were trying to figure out if he was real. She wasn't human. He had never seen anyone like her before. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Jonah couldn't tell if she was more afraid of him or the storm outside. Then, the harsh wind slammed the door shut behind her, and the world outside went silent again. She exhaled loudly, her breath visible in the cold air of the shelter as she stood frozen, staring at him. Jonah cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm, though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but he couldn't leave her out there in the storm. The woman's gaze was fixed on him. Her eyes seemed to be searching him for something, some sign of danger, or perhaps something else. Jonah couldn't tell. She didn't answer, but her posture softened slightly. She looked exhausted. Jonah took a cautious step forward. "You're safe here," he said, trying again. "I can help you, but you need to come inside and get warm." The woman's gaze flickered to the fire, and for the briefest moment, he saw a hint of longing in her eyes. But then her gaze snapped back to him, and she took a step back, as if he were the one who was dangerous. I am not from here," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't mean to intrude." She spoke in a language Jonah didn't recognize, but somehow he understood her. The language wasn't the issue. It was her fear, her caution. It was clear she was terrified, not just of the storm, but of him. Jonah held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "I'm just a human, like you. I live here." The woman looked at him. Her eyes narrowed in confusion. She didn't seem to believe him, and why would she? To her, he was just another strange creature. Humans weren't exactly common in this part of the galaxy. She probably had her own stories about humanity, none of which would have painted them in a good light. She backed away a little further, her eyes darting around the shelter, as if looking for a way to escape. Jonah could see her muscles tensing, ready to run if necessary. But then, her body seemed to sag, as though the weight of her situation had just caught up to her. "I'm not from here either," Jonah said, his voice softer now. "I'm part of a colony, just like you. We all have to stick together, you know." At his words, the woman hesitated. Her fear didn't dissipate, but something in her posture shifted. She didn't look quite as ready to flee anymore, but still, she didn't move closer. Her eyes searched the shelter, looking for a sign that she could trust him. Jonah took a deep breath, his hands still raised in the air, trying to appear non-threatening. He gestured to the fire. "Come by the fire. You're freezing." She hesitated. Jonah could see the wariness in her eyes. The conflict, it wasn't just fear of him, it was fear of what he represented. Humanity, a species that had a reputation across the galaxy. Slowly, she walked toward the fire, her movements stiff, but she didn't sit down. She simply stood there, close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough that she could dart away at a moment's notice. "I'm Jonah," he said, finally breaking the silence. "You don't have to tell me your name if you don't want to, but I'm here to help. You don't have to be alone in this storm." The woman didn't respond at first, but after a long moment, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Syra." The name sounded foreign, even to Jonah. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to ask questions or pry into her past. He was here to help her survive. He had been alone for so long that he couldn't help but offer her some sense of comfort, some kind of connection. The storm howled outside, and the shelter seemed to creak under the pressure of the wind. The two of them stood there in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Jonah was still unsure of what to make of her, but one thing was clear. They were both stuck in the same storm, and they would have to rely on each other to make it through. As the minutes passed, Jonah watched Syra closely, trying to gauge her next move. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she didn't seem to be in immediate danger. She wasn't dying from the cold, but the storm was still raging outside, and they couldn't stay here forever. Jonah stepped forward again, this time with more purpose. "I have food. You need to eat something." Syra looked at him, her eyes filled with suspicion, but also with a hint of hunger. She nodded slowly, but she didn't speak. Jonah took that as a sign that she was willing to at least trust him enough to take the food. As he prepared the simple meal, the silence between them deepened, each of them reflecting on their own struggles. The storm outside raged on, but in that small, quiet shelter, they were no longer alone. Jonah sat by the fire, watching Syra closely. She hadn't said much since she stepped inside, and he respected her silence. It was clear she was still struggling to adjust to the situation. Her eyes occasionally flickered toward him, but she never fully met his gaze. She seemed lost in thought, perhaps still processing the shock of meeting a human in this desolate place. Jonah knew what it was like to be alone. He had spent years in this isolated shelter, far from the colony, and though he had learned to embrace the solitude, it was still strange to have someone else in his space. But this wasn't just any visitor. This was a person from another world. Someone whose existence challenged everything Jonah had ever known about the universe. He glanced at her, trying to figure out what to say next, but before he could, Syra spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Why are you here?" she asked, her eyes still avoiding his. Jonah blinked in surprise. He had expected her to ask about the storm, or maybe even about the colony he was from, but she had gone straight to the heart of the matter. She wanted to know why a human was out here in the middle of nowhere, living alone on a frozen world. I'm part of the terraforming team, Jonah replied, leaning forward slightly. I've been stationed here for a long time, helping to make this place habitable for colonists. Zyra's eyes narrowed. She seemed to be processing his words carefully, as though she were unsure whether to believe him or not. Jonah didn't blame her. After all, humanity wasn't exactly a common sight in this part of the galaxy. You're alone? She asked, the disbelief clear in her voice.
Jonah nodded. For the most part.
The colony's miles away and they don't come out this far unless there's an emergency. The storms, they cut us off. I'm used to it by now. Zyra was silent for a moment, and Jonah could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was trying to make sense of everything. She had to. Meeting a human had probably been the last thing she expected when she ran into this storm. And you're okay with that? She asked, her voice laced with a touch of curiosity. Jonah shrugged. It's not ideal, but I've learned to survive. It's a different kind of life, but it's my life. He paused before adding, I don't mind being alone. Not really. I get by. Zyra studied him for a moment, then shook her head. I don't understand. How can you just survive? Don't you get lonely? Don't you miss your people? I guess you get used to it, Jonah said softly. Loneliness is something you can either fight or accept. I've learned to accept it. It's easier that way. Zyra turned her gaze back to the fire, her expression distant. Jonah could see the way her fingers tightened around her arms, as though she were bracing herself against the storm, against the weight of her own thoughts. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Jonah didn't know what Zyra was thinking, but he could sense the tension in the air. She was still scared, still unsure of what to make of him, but her body language had changed slightly. She no longer looked ready to bolt, at least not immediately. That was something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zyra looked up. I don't know what I was expecting, she said softly, but it wasn't this. Jonah tilted his head. What do you mean? She hesitated, her eyes searching the shelter once more. I've heard stories about humans. They say you're violent, that you destroy everything you touch. That you're like a plague to the galaxy. Jonah didn't flinch at her words. He had heard the stories, too. The human race wasn't exactly the most well-liked species in the universe. Not by most alien races. He had never been naive enough to believe otherwise, but hearing it from her made it sting a little more than he expected.
I won't deny that humanity has made mistakes, Jonah said, his voice steady.
We've done some terrible things, especially in the past. But we're not all like that. Not anymore. Zyra looked at him with skepticism, her eyes still filled with doubt. How can you be sure? I've seen it with my own eyes, Jonah replied. There are good people out there, people who are trying to make things right. Not everyone is out for destruction. Zyra didn't respond right away. She looked back down at her hands, her fingers slowly unclenching. Jonah could tell she was still processing his words. The idea of good humans was hard for her to wrap her mind around. The fire crackled again, and Jonah took a deep breath. I get it, he said quietly. You don't know what to think of me. Or of humanity, really. I've seen how the galaxy sees us. I've seen the fear in the eyes of other species when they talk about us. But not all of us are like the stories you've heard. Zyra's eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time since she entered the shelter, Jonah saw a faint spark of something else in her gaze. It wasn't fear exactly, but curiosity. She was beginning to wonder. Maybe she was starting to see him, not as a human, but as someone real, someone she could talk to, someone she could trust. The silence stretched on, but this time it felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was more like a quiet understanding between two people who, despite their differences, had something in common: survival. Jonah stood up, moving toward the small makeshift kitchen he had set up in the corner. He could see Zyra's eyes following him, but she didn't say anything. He was getting used to her presence. And maybe, just maybe, she was getting used to his.
"I have some food," Jonah said, turning around with a small package of ration packs in his hands.
It's not much, but it'll help. Zyra's eyes flickered to the food, and for a moment she looked hesitant, but hunger won out. She nodded, her lips tightening into a thin line as she silently accepted the offer. Jonah handed her the food, and she took it with a careful, almost delicate touch. She didn't thank him, but her actions spoke louder than words. She ate quietly, her eyes darting between him and the fire, her movements cautious but grateful. Jonah sat back down, watching her carefully. This was a turning point, he realized. They were no longer strangers. They had crossed the line between fear and trust, however small that line was. They had something in common now: the storm, the need to survive, and the bond of being two beings in an unforgiving world. As the minutes passed, the wind outside howled louder, but inside the shelter it was just the two of them, and though the storm still raged on, something had shifted. They had survived the first test, acknowledging each other's humanity, despite the differences. After a while, Zyra spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "What do you do when the storm is over?" she asked. Jonah looked at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "When the storm ends," she clarified. "What happens then?" Jonah thought for a moment before answering. "When it ends, we rebuild. We go back to work. But that's not the important part. The important part is getting through it." Zyra nodded slowly, her gaze distant once more. "And you think you can do that? Get through this storm?" Jonah smiled softly, though there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "We'll get through it," he said. "Together." Zyra didn't respond immediately, but Jonah could see her considering his words. The trust wasn't there yet, but it was beginning to form. Slowly, surely, and that was enough for now. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time since they had met, Jonah didn't feel so alone. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next as the storm continued to rage outside. Jonah and Zyra had settled into an odd sort of routine. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was no longer awkward. It had become a quiet understanding, a way of coexisting without needing to fill the air with words. The fire crackled day and night, its warmth filling the small shelter, a constant reminder that they were alive, that they were surviving. Jonah had learned more about Zyra during these days. She had told him bits and pieces of her story, though much of it was still a mystery. She came from a distant world, one Jonah couldn't even begin to pronounce. Her people were at war, caught in a struggle with a race of aliens far more dangerous than anything Jonah had encountered. She had been part of a group of refugees fleeing the conflict, trying to escape the war that had torn apart her home planet. But the storm had found her, and now here she was, with a human she didn't understand, stranded in a frozen wilderness. Zyra had never fully explained why she was so afraid of humans. Jonah had tried to ask, but every time he did, she would retreat into herself, her eyes flickering with fear or sometimes with something darker. It was clear that something had happened to her, something she wasn't ready to talk about. Jonah didn't press. He knew how it felt to carry the weight of unspoken pain. Maybe one day she would share her story with him. For now, all he could do was offer her shelter, food, and safety. Despite the language barrier, they communicated through simple gestures, shared experiences, and small moments of quiet companionship. Jonah would show her how to repair equipment, or how to set up the shelter systems to last through the storm. She, in turn, would teach him things about her world, the stars that hung in the sky above her home, the strange animals that roamed her planet, and the technology she had brought with her, which Jonah had never seen before. It was fascinating, this glimpse into another life, another civilization. But there was always a tension between them. It wasn't just the difference in their species, or the war that had brought her here. It was the fear. It was in her eyes whenever she looked at him too long. It was in the way she flinched when he reached out to help her, though she never rejected him outright. She had learned to trust him, but not completely. She had learned to rely on him, but there was still that invisible wall between them. Jonah wondered if she would ever let it down, if she would ever stop seeing him as a symbol of everything she feared. The storm outside had slowed slightly, but it was still far from over. The winds had lessened, but the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, turning the world into a blur of white. Jonah had been checking the shelter's systems, making sure everything was still running smoothly, when he heard Zyra's voice, soft and hesitant, from the corner of the room. "Jonah, do you ever wonder what happens after the storm?" Jonah turned, surprised by the question. He had thought she was lost in her own thoughts, as she often was these days. He met her gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something she couldn't find. "What do you mean?" he asked. She shifted uneasily. "I mean, after the storm is over, after we survive it. What happens next?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. The question took him off guard. He had spent so much time focusing on surviving the storm, on getting through the day, that he hadn't thought much about what came after. The storm had been all-consuming, but now that she had brought it up, the thought of it made him feel uneasy. What would happen once the storm passed? Would they just go back to their separate lives? Would they even survive the aftermath?
I don't know, he said honestly. I've never really thought that far ahead. I guess
we just keep going, surviving. Zyra looked down at her hands, as if pondering his words. "I don't know if I can keep going," she said quietly. "Not if it's always going to be like this. Running, hiding, always afraid." Jonah's heart clenched at the sadness in her voice. He wanted to tell her that things would get better, that they would find a way to move forward, but he didn't know if that was true. The universe wasn't kind to refugees, to people caught in wars they didn't choose. And the storm outside was a reminder that nature wasn't kind either. "We don't have to face it alone," Jonah said, taking a step closer to her. "You don't have to do it alone. We're here, together. We'll figure it out." Zyra met his eyes for the first time in days, and for a moment, Jonah thought he saw something in her gaze. Something that wasn't fear. It was something softer, something more vulnerable. But just as quickly, it was gone. She looked away, back toward the fire. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," she said softly. "Not after everything I've seen. Not after what happened to my people." Jonah felt a pang of sympathy for her. He didn't know the full extent of her past, but he could imagine the horrors she had witnessed. No one came to a world like this by choice. No one ended up in a storm like the one outside, without a reason. Zyra had been through something that had left her scarred, and Jonah couldn't fix that. He couldn't erase the pain she had lived through. "But I'm not like them," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not like whatever happened to you. I'm here to help, and I won't turn my back on you." Zyra was silent for a long time, and Jonah wondered if his words had even reached her. But then she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "I've never met a human like you," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I thought all humans were the same. Violent, selfish, destructive. But you're different." Jonah felt a strange mix of pride and sadness at her words. It wasn't enough to undo everything that had happened in her past, but it was something. It was a start. "I'm not perfect," he said. "None of us are, but I'll do what I can to help you, to make sure you're safe." Zyra looked at him again, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to decide if she could believe him. After a long moment, she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, but maybe I can start to trust again." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and tentative. Jonah didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. Zyra had taken a step toward healing. And for the first time since she arrived, Jonah allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they both could survive this storm and whatever came after it. The storm outside had calmed slightly, but it was far from over. Still, in that small shelter, there was a flicker of light. The storm was not just outside, it was inside too. But maybe, together, they could weather it. Together, they might find a way to survive, not just the storm, but the darkness that had followed them both for so long. Jonah turned his attention back to the fire, the warmth of the flames wrapping around him like a protective embrace. He didn't know what the future held for him and Zyra, but for now, the storm outside seemed just a little less frightening. They had each other, and that was enough. The days were slipping by, and Jonah could feel the storm outside starting to lose its grip on the world. The winds had died down, though the snow still fell thick and fast. He had learned long ago that when the storm reached its peak, it didn't just shake the world around them. It shook the very soul of the people who had to endure it. Zyra was no different. Over the past few days, she had started to open up more, though her words came with caution and a distant sadness. Jonah couldn't pretend to understand everything she had been through. Her people, her home, and the war that had forced her to flee were still mysteries to him. But he had begun to see a different side of her. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone with a past that had shaped her in ways Jonah could never fully comprehend. Still, he respected her, admired her resilience, and wanted to protect her in any way he could. They had made it through the worst of the storm, but it was clear that there were still dangers ahead. The weather was only one challenge. They would have to leave the shelter soon. There was no food supply here, no communication with the outside world. Once the storm subsided enough, they had to leave. The question was where they would go. Zyra had been pacing more in recent hours, her restlessness growing. She had been quieter, her thoughts turning inward again, as if something were weighing heavily on her mind. Jonah could feel the change in the air, the tension that filled the room whenever she was deep in thought. He watched her for a moment, her eyes lost in the swirling snow outside the shelter's small window. "Do you think it will ever stop?" she asked suddenly, her voice filled with something Jonah couldn't quite place. Fear? Hope? It was hard to tell. Jonah looked toward the window. The snow had thickened again, and the winds were picking up once more. "The storm?" he asked, though he knew that wasn't what she was talking about. The storm outside had become a symbol for something much deeper for her. Zyra nodded. "The storm," she said quietly, "but not just the weather. Everything." Jonah exhaled slowly, turning his gaze to the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting warm shadows against the cold walls of the shelter. "I don't know," he said after a pause. "I think it will stop. It always does eventually." She seemed to mull over his words, but her expression remained uncertain. "I don't know if I can keep going. If I can keep running. The war, it's everywhere. It doesn't end. It just keeps chasing me, no matter how far I go." Jonah stood up, crossing the room to where she stood, her face drawn with the weight of her fears. "You don't have to keep running anymore," he said, his voice firm. "You're not alone now. We'll figure it out together. We can find a place where it's safe." Zyra looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for something she still couldn't see. "And what if I'm wrong? What if I can never outrun it? What if the war finds me even here in the middle of nowhere? Jonah reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her in a way that felt more like a gesture of reassurance than of survival. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness that had settled into her bones over the days they had spent together. "You don't have to do this alone," he repeated softly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." For a long moment, Zyra didn't speak. She just stood there, her gaze distant, as though she were sorting through everything that had happened. Jonah felt a knot tighten in his chest. He didn't know how to fix things for her. He didn't have the answers. All he could do was offer his presence, his support. Maybe that was enough for now. Finally, Zyra spoke, her voice softer, but still filled with a certain fragility. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again. Not after everything. But maybe I can try. Maybe I can try with you." Jonah's heart surged at her words, though he didn't let his emotions show. He simply nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to trust me all at once. Trust is something that takes time."
"But I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone."
Zyra looked down at her feet for a moment, her hands shaking ever so slightly. Then she took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for something, and turned back to face the shelter's entrance. The storm had weakened slightly, but the world outside was still a swirling mass of snow and ice. Jonah stepped beside her, standing tall and steady, offering her the same quiet strength he always had. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. They had survived together, and that meant something. It meant they were stronger than they had been before. As Zyra looked out into the blizzard, Jonah watched her, his thoughts racing. The war she spoke of, the war that had followed her to this distant world, it wasn't something he could simply fight off. It wasn't something he could change, but what he could offer was the one thing he had learned to value most in his life: hope. "We'll make it through this," Jonah said quietly, almost to himself. Zyra turned to look at him, her expression guarded, but something in her eyes softened. "Do you really believe that?" Jonah nodded. "Yeah, I do." They both stood there for a long time, looking out into the endless white storm, the howling winds barely audible above their thoughts. The storm outside seemed to reflect the turmoil inside both of them. But there was a difference now. They were no longer facing it alone. Together they had made it through the worst. Together, they would face whatever came next. The storm would pass. It always did. And maybe, just maybe, the same could be said for the darkness that had haunted Zyra for so long. Zyra finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm not running anymore."
"Not if you're with me."
Jonah turned to her, a warmth spreading through him at her words.
"You don't have to run."
"You're home now, at least for as long as you need." Zyra gave him a small, uncertain smile, but it was enough. It was a sign that the fear inside her was starting to fade, that the trust between them was beginning to grow. The storm outside began to weaken even further, and Jonah could see the first light of dawn beginning to peek through the thick layers of snow. The horizon still looked like an endless white wasteland, but there was a shift in the air. The storm was not done, but it was no longer the only force at play. Together, Jonah and Zyra had endured it. Together, they had survived. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jonah allowed himself to believe that maybe they would make it through the aftermath too. The storm had brought them together. And now, it was up to them to face whatever came next.